wherever you're joining us from. If you're in the UK or in Europe, then good afternoon. If you're in the US, then good morning, and anywhere else, then good evening. It's really good to have you with us for our annual church history address at Edinburgh Theological Seminary. Normally, we'd be gathering in the grand presbytery hall within the building at Edinburgh Theological Seminary on the mound in the centre of Edinburgh. And we sincerely hope that by the time we do this next year, we'll be able to enjoy some kind of normality. But for the moment, we're restricted to what is allowed. However, COVID has forced us to be creative. And in this case, we're taking advantage of the opportunities that technology affords us, which today is to hear our guest speaker, Dr. Carl Trueman. Before I introduce Carl, let's open in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you are sovereign over all things, including the strange times in which we live. And we thank you that technology allows us to reach out to one another and interact from all over the world. And we pray to take advantage of this great opportunity in order to reflect on the important issues that are before us. We thank you for this opportunity that we have to come together from all over the world to do that. And we do pray that your Spirit will guide our thoughts this afternoon. We thank you for our guest speaker, Dr. Trueman, and we thank you that he's able to join us today. And we do pray that as he delivers his address, that he may know your presence and your power. We thank you for all your goodness to us. We pray that you will encourage us by the power of your Spirit to think of the fundamental questions about existence and life and why we're here. And we pray that these questions will draw us to the offer that your word gives in Jesus Christ, that we might find life in him and that we might know him to be our Savior and our Lord. We pray that you will bless our time together in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, like I say, we're absolutely thrilled that by means of technology, we're able to welcome to Scotland, in a way, Dr. Carl Trueman. He's Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, originally a Reformation specialist. His most recent work has been in the areas of modernity, selfhood, and identity politics. His latest book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is an academic exploration into the background behind much of what is known today as progressive ideology, and it helps us understand where we are at present in terms of much popular thinking. This afternoon, he's going to link the past with the present by focusing on one particular influential mind, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'm so thrilled that Carl has found the time to be with us today, and I'm sure that if we were all here, there'd be a different atmosphere, of course. We'd all be gathered together, but I'm sure that on your behalf, you're as thrilled as I am that he's able to devote some of his morning to deliver our annual lecture. And I hope that he can sense something of the Scottish atmosphere at this event. There'll be a time after his address for questions, and the instructions have been on your screen. Please feel free to do so, either by submitting your name or anonymously, and these questions will be put to Carl after his address. But meanwhile, enough from me. Let me welcome Dr. Trueman to deliver this address. Thank you, Carl.
There you see. That's why I'm not a technology guy. Yeah, I've been on a very steep learning curve for the last 12 months, learning to do things like unmute myself before I speak, but I still haven't quite mastered it. Wanted to say thank you very much for your kind words of introduction, Ivor. Of course, Katrina, my wife, and I have very fond memories and a lot of affection for the Free Church of Scotland. We met in Bonaccord, Aberdeen, many years ago, while both sitting under the ministry of Alec MacDonald, who then married us, and that was we still remember his ministry with great fondness. I did my pastoral internship in Livingston and had the privilege of shadowing Professor John Angus MacLeod for a while. And I was telling him earlier that one incident in particular I've used as a sermon and indeed a lecture illustration over the years. I learned a huge amount from shadowing him that summer. And of course, I had the privilege of being on session in Bonaccord with yourself when you are a minister. I said, when you were a minister, you are still a minister, of course. So it's a pleasure to see you, albeit virtually. It's an honor to be asked to give this address. Rousseau may not be the typical fare for a church history address at a reformed seminary. The reason I want to talk on Rousseau is that over the last few years, I've become intrigued, puzzled by, fascinated by certain aspects of the way we all intuitively think in present day and age. How much of how we think in terms of morality or ethics is often driven by kind of gut reactions or intuitions or feelings. And also, I've been fascinated at how fast notions of human identity and human selfhood seem to have, in one sense, unraveled or changed dramatically. And it was in exploring these sort of modern phenomena that I became convinced that in order to understand them, we need to go back in time. And there are some key thinkers who perhaps we've never read, maybe we've never even heard of, but who in some ways capture important aspects of the present age. And reflecting on their thinking allows us to reflect upon ourselves and reflect upon our own age in a more accurate and helpful way. We cannot help the age we live in. We cannot help the water we swim in or the air that we breathe in, but becoming aware of some of the peculiarities of our age allows us, I won't say to free ourselves from them, but at least to stand in a more critical and an independent relationship to them than we might otherwise have been. And that's where I think Rousseau is helpful. And that's why I want to spend just a few moments this morning thinking about some aspects of Rousseau's thought and then applying them to issues that we find ourselves facing today. I'm conscious that I'm going to be raising more questions in terms of the present day than I'm going to be providing answers. That's what historians do. Historians, we make the past more complicated and therefore we make the present more complicated. And we always hesitate to predict what the future will look like because we know it's been done so many times in history, and almost always the prophets and the predictors have been proved wrong. But I do hope that what I say today will at least sow some thoughts in your minds about how to think about the situation in which the church finds herself today. First of all, a little bit of background on Rousseau. His dates, 1712 to 1778. He was born in Geneva. Often referred to him as the other Genevan. If you're a Reformed Christian, then when you think of Geneva, your mind goes typically to the 16th century and to John Calvin. Arguably, the other Genevan, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is far more influential today than Calvin. He was a self-taught polymath, a rather remarkable individual, and he has a fascinating and somewhat spectacular career. He's a civil servant. He's a musician and a composer. He develops his own system of musical notation. He's a philosopher. He was a novelist. He was a political theorist. He's one of the key political inspirations behind the French Revolution. And he's an educational innovator, if you've ever come across the notion of child-centered learning. And that sort of tracks back to Rousseau. Rousseau has a significant part to play in the development of modern educational theories. As a character, I find myself torn and conflicted. He's a hard guy to dislike. He writes very well. His autobiography, his Confessions, is a very witty production and very entertaining. And yet he was somewhat prone to paranoia. He fell out very badly with the Scottish philosopher David Hume. And worst of all, he had all of his children taken to an orphanage shortly after their birth. And an orphanage in the 18th century would have been a death sentence. So we might say that Rousseau was responsible for the death of all of his children. And his rationale for that was simply he thought the orphanage would be a better father than he would be. Well, If an 18th century orphanage would be a better father than you, then you are a particularly pathetic specimen of fatherhood. So he's a very ambiguous figure in some ways. I say hard to dislike because he writes with such wit and style. And yet when you dig down into the details of how he treated other people, he's a much darker character than perhaps he himself would have liked to have thought. I want to look at just a couple of his works today. He wrote very widely. He wrote a novel, Julie. He wrote an autobiography, The Confessions. Famously, he wrote his first and second discourses that have become staples of political and cultural theory, or the history of political and cultural theory over the years. He wrote a long book, Emile, which is really a long reflection on how to raise children. You know, one might raise serious questions about his competence to do that, but a very influential theory of education is developed in his book, Emile. And then, of course, The Social Contract. Like his sort of British or English counterpart, John Locke, he thought of society in contractual terms. Slightly different view to Locke, but was very much in the sort of forefront of political thinking in the 18th century. Today, I want to focus on his Confessions, and I want to look at the first and second discourses. And I want to pull out from these works significant developments or significant examples of things that I think have profoundly shaped how the modern mind thinks. We don't have to have read Rousseau to have intuitions shaped by the world that Rousseau helped to form. And that's what I want to get at today. So the Confessions then, what is it? Well, it's his autobiography. He decides that he's going to write his life story. The way he does it, though, gives things an interesting twist. I'll read you a quotation here about what he says about his intention in writing the Confessions. He says this: "I am resolved on an undertaking that has no model and no imitator. I want to show my fellow men a man in all the truth of nature, and this man is to be myself." So his autobiography then is to be an attempt to present himself to his audience, but to do so in a way that gives them more than just trivial gossip about the life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to do something that presents them with, we might say, man in the raw. He's going to set forth a model here of what it's like to be a man in terms of his nature. He goes on, "The particular object of my Confessions is to make known my inner self, exactly as it was in every circumstance of my life. It is the history of my soul that I promised, and to relate it faithfully, I require no other memorandum. All I need to do, as I have done up until now, is look inside myself." And this is where Rousseau is thinking he's going to make his contribution. He's going to write his life story, but the focus is going to be on his inner psychological states. We might say it's going to be a story of his feelings as he finds himself in the various circumstances of life. To know who he really is, to know who Rousseau really is, he needs to go inward. He needs to delve into the depths of his soul and then expose that to the world around in order to show an authentic human being in all of his authenticity. Now, just stop there for a second. That's an interesting move. It's not entirely unprecedented. We see actually in European culture, really from the late Middle Ages onwards, an increasing move to reflect upon the inner life of human beings. We can think of the struggles, for example, that Martin Luther has when he's convicted of sin. That's definitely an introspective move on the part of Luther, of a kind that's hard to find, really, certainly in the Middle Ages and rarely in the early church, this introspective move. Well, Rousseau's going to take it to the next level. He's going to say the real you, the real life, is that which goes on inside your head. That is the thing that is definitive of you. So he's making a play here to put feelings and psychology right at the heart of who and what one is. Now, You may have noticed that in one of the quotations I just gave, Rousseau says he's going to do something without a precedent. He says, I'm going to do something new and unique. If you were aware of Western literature, certainly if you're aware of Christian literature, your mind will immediately go to Augustine and Augustine's great work of the 390s, late 4th century, Augustine's Confessions, in which Augustine talks about his life in terms of his inner feelings. And it's very clear that an educated man like Rousseau would have known of Augustine's Confessions, and there's internal evidence in his Confessions that he does so. We're going to come to that in a few seconds' time. You might say, well, but doesn't Augustine go inward? Surely there's this inward move in Augustine. I want to say just at this point in the lecture, say, certainly. In fact, we don't even need to go to Augustine. We could go to the Psalms. We can look at the Psalter of David. And the Psalms are full of reflection on inner experience and inner feeling. But there's a difference. The difference is this. For Augustine and for the psalmist, the move inward is really a prelude to a move outward. Augustine's Confessions is set up as a prayer. Ultimately, he's speaking out to God, and he finds his identity in God. For the psalmist, much the same. The Psalms are prayers. Ultimately, the Psalms are not about you might say. I remember Michael Horton wrote an amusing article a few years ago, riffing off the Carly Simon song, "You're so vain, I bet you think this psalm is about you." Well, what Mike was getting at there is that the Psalms, yes, they do speak about our inner feelings, but they always move outward. Ultimately, human identity is grounded for the psalmist, as it is for Augustine, in outward things. For Rousseau, no. For Rousseau, identity, really true identity, authentic identity, is the identity of the individual who finds him or herself by moving inward. This is brought out rather dramatically in a passage, or the implications of this are brought out rather dramatically in a passage in Rousseau's Confessions, where he is clearly responding to a passage in Augustine's Confessions. If you read the Confessions of Augustine, you'll know that in Book 2, he describes his fall, the big sin, and he uses a particular incident in his youthful life to explore the psychology of sin. And the incident's a very trivial one. It involves him and a group of friends late one night stealing some pears from a neighbor's garden. And the funny thing is, the pears are pretty revolting. He's got better pears at home. They don't eat these pears. As far as he can remember, they throw them to the pigs. They feed them to the pigs, and they go on their merry way, laughing and enjoying the stunt they pulled off against their neighbor. And it leads Augustine to engage in significant reflection on, well, what motivated me to do that? If there was no personal gain, if I wasn't satiating my hunger, if I wasn't selling them for money, if I was just stealing them to throw them away, what motivated me? And Augustine's answer is, well, what motivated me was the kick I got from breaking the law. Because when you break the law, you place yourself above the law. Who's above the law? God's above the law. God is the one who makes the laws. When you break the law, when you sin, you feel like God. And Augustine reflects on this, thinks, and that's the problem of the sin of Adam. The sin of Adam is about breaking the law so you feel like God. And Augustine, of course, will later go on and elaborate this idea in other works to sort of formulate his notion of original sin. This idea that human beings, we all fell in Adam, and that we now have a natural and unavoidable tilt towards breaking the law. In other words, for Augustine, if you like, the conclusion of this is we're born corrupt. We are born corrupt. We are born, we might say, using Rousseau-type terminology, we are born inauthentic. We're born not as we should be, but as we should not be. I think it's with that passage in mind that Rousseau reflects upon a similar incident in his own childhood. And I'm going to read you the passage from the Confessions, Rousseau's Confessions. It is nearly always some good but ill-directed impulse that leads children into taking the first step towards evil. My master, he's working as a servant at this time, my master had a journeyman called Monsieur Verrat, whose mother lived in a house nearby, but with a garden some way away, which produced fine asparagus. Monsieur Verrat, who did not have much money, hit upon the notion of stealing his mother's early asparagus and selling it in exchange for a few good meals. Since he did not want to risk being seen himself, and since he was not very agile, he asked me to mount this expedition for him. After some initial coaxing, by which I was the more easily won over in that I did not see where it was leading, he suggested to me as an idea that had only just occurred to him. I argued long and hard, and he persisted. I have never been able to resist flattery, and I gave in. I went every morning and harvested the best asparagus. I took it to the molar, where some woman or other who could see that I had just stolen it would say so in order to get it from me cheaper. In my fright, I would accept whatever she chose to give me, which I then took to Monsieur Verrat. It was promptly exchanged for a meal which I had procured, but which was shared with another friend, while I, who would have been glad of any morsel that came my way, received not so much as a taste of wine. And that passage, a number of things. First of all, it persuades me that whatever else he says, Rousseau is aware of Augustine's confessions. And what he's doing in his confessions is setting himself up as the anti-Augustine, among other things. He's offering an alternative account of what it means to be human, of what it means to be a human person. Secondly, notice the similarities. Notice the similarities in the two passages. Both involve an act of theft. Both involve an act of theft of vegetables or fruit. I have to confess, my wife has a thing about asparagus. She's always serving it. I'll eat it, but I don't think I would ever bother stealing it. I probably would never bother buying it if left to myself. But hey, it's 18th century Geneva. Maybe asparagus was a sought after commodity in that day. So there's a theft of we might say, fairly trivial theft of plant matter, of foodstuffs. And it's a theft that leads to no personal profit for the one thieving. Augustine doesn't gain anything materially by his theft. Rousseau gains nothing materially by his theft. So the question is, why does Rousseau do it? And a little bit of background here. Rousseau goes on to be something of a compulsive thief in his young life. And one tragic incident where he steals a handkerchief from his employer and then frames one of the housemaids who's been nothing but kind to him. He frames her for the crime, and she is fired and kicked out, and he doesn't know whether does she die in the open, does she has to take to a life of vice. Years later, he's reflecting on this and feeling very bad about it. But thieving became something of a problem for Rousseau. And the question behind this passage is, so where did this come from? And the answer that Rousseau gives is very different to that of Augustine. The answer Rousseau gives is, I started on my life of crime, actually for good reasons. I started on my life of crime to help poor Monsieur Verrat, who convinced me that he needed some money to buy food. It was my sort of desire to help that triggered my fall, my sin, if you like, my descent into a life of crime. And he also adds to the mix there, notice how Verrat persuades him. It isn't just Verrat's state of necessity that persuades Rousseau to engage in this activity. He says, Verrat also flattered me, and I liked flattery, and it sort of coaxed me into this life of crime. Now, we might step back then and draw a comparison, a broad comparison between Rousseau and Augustine, and say what lies behind these two passages are two fundamentally different views of what it means to be a human being in this world. For Augustine, to be a human being is to be fallen. It's to have a natural tilt, a natural bent, a natural propensity towards breaking the law and doing that which is wrong. For Rousseau, no. Rousseau was born fine. Left to his own devices, he'd have been okay. The problem is Rousseau finds himself in a situation where the social network, the social framework, the social relationships which surround him drive him to corruption. And that is a central notion for Rousseau. And it's one that will go on to grip the moral imagination of our present day. When so often we think in terms of, well, so-and-so was screwed up by their environment. It's not entirely false, of course. Kids born into certain environments where crime is rife, where they're neglected, they're abused, they can go off the rails more easily, perhaps, than a kid who wasn't born into that circumstance. But that default notion that it's society that screws you up, that's there in Rousseau. And it connects, of course, to that idea that to find the pristine human being, I need to retreat from all the relationships around me into myself. And I need to think about myself and my own psychology in order to find an authentic person. We might put this in theological terms and say, Rousseau has a highly Pelagian view of human nature. So that's the Confessions then. Confessions, of course, will be the genre of psychological introspection, will be the stuff of culture right down to the present day. We see in the work of Rousseau an adumbration of great novels of the 19th century. I hate Zooming generally, but I've joined an online discussion group this year. I thought with all the lockdown, it would be a chance to read all those long books that I always wanted to read, never had a chance to read. So I'm in an online discussion group about Dostoevsky's Demons at the moment, about this radical group in this town in Russia. And there's so much psychology there. So much psychology in Dostoevsky's works because the inner life has become so fascinating to the modern mind. We see some of the roots of that in the works of Rousseau. So that's the Confessions then. Building on that, I want to now move to the First Discourse. The First Discourse was Rousseau's famous essay that wins a competition. He's been visiting his friend Denis Diderot, one of the Enlightenment thinkers. And while he's walking along the road, he comes across a handbill advertising an essay competition by the Mercure de France, which was a sort of newspaper, like 18th century newspaper or bulletin. The Academy of Dijon has set an essay competition for individuals to write a response to the following question. And the question is this: has the progress of sciences and the arts led to the corruption or purification of morals? Has the progress of the sciences and the arts led to the corruption or purification of morals? Now, I don't think there's much doubt that the Academy of Dijon was by and large expecting people to answer that it has led to the purification of morals. This is 18th century France. We're seeing the rise of the philosophers, the rise of what we now call Enlightenment thinking, the idea that knowledge improves, that the sciences open up humanity and civilization to us in a way that we could never have known before. Rousseau, of course, is Rousseau. Rousseau is a natural contrarian, and he answers the other way. No, the arts and the sciences have actually corrupted morals and corrupted people. You can see it ties together with that notion in the Confessions that it's our social relations that are the problem. And the First Discourse will be the first published, because the Confessions are published somewhat later, the first published statement of Rousseau's understanding of what we might call the harmful effects of culture on nature. Here's a quotation from his First Discourse. "How sweet it would be to live among us if the outward countenance were always the image of the heart's dispositions, if decency were virtue, if our maxims were our rules, if genuine philosophy were inseparable from the title of philosopher, before art has fashioned our manners and taught our passions to speak in ready-made terms. Our morals were rustic but natural, and differences in conduct conveyed differences of character at first glance." Notice what he's saying there. Wouldn't it be great if what you see is what you get? When you engage in conversation with the person they present to you is the person that they are inside. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be wonderful? We have words to describe people who present as one thing, but they're really another. We call them hypocrites, two-faced, duplicitous. One of the advantages, and the Scots among you will appreciate this, my wife is out, she's a Scot, but she'll appreciate it. It's a bit of criticism of my own race, the English race. I remember having to meet with numerous people over the years where who I find fundamentally despicable in some way or another. And every now and then you'll be asked, how do you manage in those situations? My answer is, hey, I'm English. Being two-faced, it's what we do. We naturally do that. And Rousseau here is saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if the normative type was not the Englishman who can pretend to like you, but really despise you, and was actually the normative person was outwardly that which they are inwardly. By the way, on my office at Grove, I have on the door one of those translator things about what the English say, what the English mean, what Americans think they say. So, for example, you must come and see me next time you're in town. Americans think that means you must come and see me next time you're in town. An Englishman means you must never come and see me. I never want to see you again. Rousseau here is really engaging in that anti-duplicity sort of polemic. And he goes on, he says this, today, when subtler inquiries and a more refined taste have reduced the art of pleasing to principles, a vile and deceiving uniformity prevails in our morals, and all minds seem to have been cast in the same mold. Constantly, politeness demands, propriety commands. Constantly, one follows custom, never one's own genius. One no longer dares to appear what one is, and under this perpetual constraint, the men who make up the herd that is called society will, when placed in similar circumstances, act in similar ways, unless more powerful motives incline them differently. In other words, Rousseau is saying, once you're a member of society, you're performing a role. You're performing a role. Society demands of you a certain role. It requires you to behave in certain ways in order to get on. Remember when he talked about Monsieur Varane, he says it was the flattery that got to me. What he's really saying there is, I wanted to be big in Monsieur Varane's eyes, and when he told me that I was so cool, etc., then I felt, yeah, I want to do stuff that really confirms that and cements that idea in his mind. Rousseau said, the problem with society is it makes us competitive. Everybody's always out to get one up on somebody else. Everybody's always out to show off. Everybody's always out to pretend to be something that they are not. And society demands this. Because if you don't play society's game, you will not get on, and you will find yourself shunted to the margins. Now let's stop there and think, okay, so how does this play out in our modern world? What's Trueman getting at when he says, okay, by reflecting on Rousseau, it gives us a handle for reflecting somewhat critically, perhaps, on our own society? I would say this, there are a couple of things here. One, Rousseau is arguing that men and women in a state of nature, i.e. before society squeezes them into its mold, are more genuinely themselves. And that gives rise to that quintessentially modern notion of what a person should be. And that's authenticity. Being authentic. Authenticity. Isn't that an interesting criterion for judging a person? They're authentic. What do we mean by that? What you see is what you get. The person who's speaking to you is an accurate representation of the person who's thinking about you inside their head. It also leads to this, that the ideal person, the true person, is the natural person, not the cultured or the cultivated person. The latter, the cultured, the cultivated person, they're inauthentic. William Wordsworth, famous English poet of the late 18th, early 19th century, wrote in his collection of poems, lyrical ballads, wrote a poem, The Idiot Boy. Very politically incorrect title today, but The Idiot Boy is a poem about a lad who's, we would say, simple. He's a simple lad. He has learning difficulties. And what you see is what you get. And Wordsworth was challenged on this by one of his students, John Wilson, this student of Wordsworth, wrote him and says, isn't it distasteful to write a poem about a lad with learning difficulties? And Wordsworth says, no, because that's precisely where you see a genuine person, We would say of that lad with with learning difficulties, he has no filters. What does that mean? He speaks his mind. He is exactly who he says he is. Now think about the implications of this. It sets up, if you think about selfhood, identity, what makes you genuinely you in this way, it sets up an immediately what we might call an adversarial relationship between you and society as it's existed, or between you and history. Think about that. Think about, for example, the testimony of Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner, the poster child of the transgender movement. You can go online and find an interesting interview when he came out. He's still Bruce, and transitioning to Caitlyn in 2015 with an American journalist, Diane Sawyer. The language he uses is very interesting in that interview. He says he's lived a lie. He's finally free to be himself. He's done with performing the role that society demands of him. That's Rousseau. That's Rousseau. And why is it that in reading that interview, it sort of resonates with us? We may not agree with all the way he's going, but the language means something to him. It resonates with us. That's because Rousseau's won in some ways. Rousseau's notion of culture has won. Think about politicians. It's always struck me as interesting, and maybe this is an analogy that works better in the States than in Scotland, but it's always struck me as interesting that one of the things that really finished Richard Nixon in the Watergate scandal of the early 1970s were the Watergate tapes. And one of the most controversial aspects of the Watergate tapes, apart from the bit that was, accidentally erased, was the transcript where it kept saying expletive deleted. And that horrified the American people, that the President of the United States would use profane language in private meetings was profoundly horrifying to the culture of that day. Think about that now. I don't know what it's like in the UK these days, but I'm hard pressed to think of an American politician who doesn't use profanity in speeches, including the current president. Even the F word can be used in speeches. Why do they do that? They do that because they know that it works. Why does it work? Because we all know that the language we use in private, or most of us, is not what it should be and is not what we would use in public. When a politician now swears in public, they're being authentic. They're sending a message, you can trust me, because I'm not using language in private that I'm not prepared to use in public. Rousseau has won. Authenticity has moved to center stage. Old-fashioned values, reserve, self-control, privacy, modesty, all of these things start to look dangerously corrupting in a world that has bought the Rousseau idea of what it means to be a human being. Why is it that when a sports star leaves his wife of many years to take up with his gay lover, it's presented often in the newspaper as a brave move? It's brave because guess what? He's being authentic. Those old moral codes that bound him to lifelong heterosexual monogamy, they prevented him from being the real person that he is inside. So this is where this stuff starts to really have an impact upon us. You want to understand the logic of the way society thinks today, you could do a lot worse than reflecting on the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Even affects Christian piety. We have a tendency in Christianity often to think, well, we thank you, Lord, that we're not like other men and women, those Rousseau-influenced people over there who don't even know they're influenced by Rousseau. Because we can tend that way ourselves. I often say to students, that voice, I got this quotation from somebody else, but that voice inside your head telling you to do that stuff, that's not God. That's you. Don't identify your psychology with the voice of God. That's a Rousseau kind of move. And indeed, it's the sort of move that he makes in his second discourse. Second discourse, his full title is this: Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men. And here, in some ways, he makes more explicit and more dramatic that which he's sort of been moving towards in the First Discourse. Man's first language, he says, the most universal, the most energetic, and the only language he needed before it was necessary to persuade assembled men is the cry of nature. This is where later writers, I don't think Rousseau ever uses this term, but they'll talk about Rousseau's notion of the noble savage, the idea that man, left to his own devices, will follow this cry of nature within his heart, and that will lead him to do the right thing. Again, just notice the power we ascribe to inner feelings today, the power we ascribe to inner desires. The trans movement is only the most extreme example of this. You feel you're a man inside, but you have the body of a woman, then you are a man, because your feelings have that kind of authority. Switch on, watch Oprah Winfrey, watch any number of chat shows. What is the moral register of those sort of chat shows that you watch on TV? Feelings. I know it's true because it feels so good. I know it's true in my heart. And if we're honest, this kind of language is not alien to a lot of the Christian world either. The idea that our inner feelings are a kind of guide runs very deep, even in Christianity. Now, Rousseau's not entirely off base here. I'll give you another quotation. He says, "It's quite certain that pity is a natural sentiment by moderating in every individual the activity of self-love, contrary to the mutual preservation of the entire species. It is pity that carries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see suffer, pity that in the state of nature takes the place of laws, morals, and virtues." Is Trueman saying, well, feelings don't count for anything? Well, no, and I think Rousseau is onto something there. You know, if I look out of my window here and I see my next door neighbor being beaten up by a gang of hooligans, and I have to Google, what should I do when my neighbor's being beaten up by a gang of hooligans? You'd rightly say that Trueman's he's a sociopath. He's a sociopath. When you see somebody being beaten up, you should immediately feel empathy for them and try to help them in whatever way you can. Clearly, sentiments and feelings play into the way we think ethically. The problem, of course, comes when, well, what happens when sentiments are all there is? The thing that saves Rousseau and the thing that saves his heirs, the Romantics, from a kind of ethical subjectivism whereby anything goes is this. They believe there is such a thing as human nature. And by human nature, they don't just mean, there's a biological family of human beings such that we can reproduce with each other, but we can't reproduce with frogs or squirrels or whatever. It doesn't just mean there's a biological human nature. Rousseau and the Romantics also believe that human nature has a natural moral structure, such that if we go back behind the corruptions of society to that inner cry of nature, your cry of nature will be the same as my cry of nature. We'll all be empathetic with each other and will emerge as virtuous and morally upright people. The problem, of course, is, and this is where, if you like, Rousseau's world and our world do differ, is that our world has abandoned the notion of human nature having a moral structure that imposes a particular model or set of models of moral flourishing upon us. What we have today is Rousseau's sentiments, Rousseau's inner life, detached from any objective notion of human nature as possessing a moral shape. And that raises interesting and somewhat disturbing questions, doesn't it? What happens if human nature lacks moral shape? What if our instincts are actually darker than Rousseau imagined? What if Augustine, if you're a Christian, or Freud, if you're a non-Christian, actually understood human nature better than Rousseau did? That those instincts we have are not naturally empathetic, but are dark and destructive. And that helps us to understand some of the chaos, I think, that we see emerging in the world around us. Secondly, I think it helps us, Rousseau helps us here understand why so much of the language we now use about morality is not language of good and evil or good and bad. It's language of taste. It's language of sentiment. I find that comment hurtful. I find that comment offensive. That was a really distasteful action or distasteful joke, or that person disgusts me. Notice, that's the sort of typical ethical and moral language of our day. It's the language of sentiment and taste. It's not the language of right or wrong. I was very encouraged in the pre-meeting for the lecture today, just to make sure that I wouldn't do stupid things like not unmute myself when I started to speak. I met with John Angus and Alistair Wilson, old friends. And it's very encouraging at my age to meet with guys of a similar age who've also lost all their hair. They're bald guys. And I could have pointed at John Angus or Alistair, or indeed at myself, and said, look at you, bald guy. That would have been hurtful. It would have been offensive. Would have been true. Would actually have been true. Language of taste. It's interesting the way that has come to grip the modern moral imagination, because it actually shifts us away from thinking about morality in objective terms, right and wrong, and shifts us towards thinking about morality in what I would call aesthetic terms, or we might say terms of gut reactions. Again, goes back to Rousseau, that statement I read from Rousseau. Here's another one. I would show that justice and goodness are not merely abstract words, pure moral beings formed by the understanding, but are true affections of the soul enlightened by reason. Are hence only an ordered development of our primitive affections. We could switch affections for sentiments or tastes there. That by reason alone, independent of conscience, no natural law can be established. That the entire right of nature is only a chimera if it is not founded on a natural need in the human heart. Rousseau is saying there, morality is ultimately an emotional taste thing. But that's okay for Rousseau because he still believes human nature has a moral structure. In our world, we have Rousseau's taste, but we've abandoned even that vestige, the understanding of humanity made with a moral structure that Rousseau still had. We might also say another aspect of this emphasis that Rousseau has on the inner self is what? I would say bodies become incidental. It's weird, isn't it? But think of that statement, I was born in the wrong body. That's a fascinating statement because it radically separates the I from the body. Runs straight up against Orthodox Christian teaching, of course. Christianity is a religion of the resurrection. We are resurrected. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica talks about the end times, the personal end times, dying and going to heaven. When you die, when your body dies, he says, you go to heaven. You're in the presence of God, but it is not you. It is merely your soul. It will not be you fully in the presence of God until your body is reunited to your soul. So often, even in Christianity, we prioritized the mind or prioritized the spirit over the body. I say to you, no, you don't inhabit your body. In a deep sense, you are your body. Your body is integral to your identity. And the statement, I was born in the wrong body, indicates that you are fundamentally thinking about the I in the wrong way. Again, we can track it back in an intellectual genealogy to Rousseau and further back behind Rousseau, but where the thoughts, where the mind, where the inner life, rather than the physical body becomes important. Think about Dostoevsky. One of the problems with reading Dostoevsky novels is it takes you a while just to work out who's who, because everybody has a patronymic. Pyotr Stepanovich is one of the characters in Dostoevsky's Demons. That's an interesting way of identifying somebody, isn't it? Peter, the son of Stepan. His identity is fundamentally that he's the son of Stepan. He's a body that ultimately derives bodily from somebody else's body. His identity, we might say, is primarily social and external. to himself. And the existence of patronymics speaks of that. My wife is from Lewis, got very used to, when we visit Lewis, wandering around and start chatting to somebody and they'd say to you, and who are your people? Which was a polite way of saying, sunshine, you're nobody until I can connect you to a social network. And social networks require bodies. Finally, what lessons then might we draw from the church for this? Well, I would say, first of all, in our teaching, we need to be taught consistently that sin has an impact on the way we think, even as Christians. Our minds, what we think and feel inside, is not a reliable guide to reality. If anything, our minds can be constantly trying to tilt and distort reality, something Rousseau misses to his deep cost. Secondly, I would suggest we need to start thinking in ways about human individuals that understands us first and foremost as social creatures. The whole of Rousseau's thinking and all of Western thought that sort of stands in his wake has tilted away from thinking of human beings as defined first and foremost by the relationships we have. Rousseau says, man was born free and everywhere is in chains. One of the most self-evidently false statements ever made in the history of humanity, and yet one that has gripped the imagination. When I was born, I was utterly dependent upon others for my survival. Humanity, almost like, I'm not quite sure if I could say this for every creature on the face of the planet, but humanity is one of the most dependent creatures in terms of relying on others in its species and the planet. We are remarkably dependent upon our parents for survival for an awful long time compared to hamsters, mice, gerbils, rabbits, etc. We need to really start thinking of ourselves as not defined by our inner feelings, but it's defined by our social relations. And that, I think, should transform our understanding of the church. The American Jewish thinker, Yuval Levine, if you've not read Yuval Levine's stuff, he is I think, one of the most profound and insightful political theorists and thinkers of the day. He wrote a book, A Time to Build, about a year ago on institutions, primarily for an American audience, but I think it would translate to any Western country. And in that book, Levine says, under the impact of the kind of notion of the self that I've been articulating in this lecture, institutions have been transformed in terms of their purpose. You'd say institutions used to be places where you would go for formation. I went to a traditional English grammar school. You went there to be bashed into shape, to be a decent member of society. Sometimes, of course, in those days, literally bashed into shape. School was a place of formation. Levine says what has happened in the last 40, 50 years, though, is an almighty shift, really bringing institutions into line with this idea that the genuine you is the you that dwells inside before society screws you up. He says institutions are no longer places of formation. They become places of performance, enabling you to realize yourself, enabling you to express yourself. The church needs to think about what Levine says there, because that has profound implications for how we think about what church is. Do we go to church in order to perform? Do we go to church in order to have our needs met? Do we go to church in order to be made to feel good about ourselves? Or do we go to church to be formed as part of a community? I would suggest that the latter is very much the vision that the New Testament presents. And indeed, James Bannerman, great free church divine, of course, and one of the most distinguished professors in the free church's history, in his book on the Church of Christ, he says, I'm putting it in modern idiom that he would never have used, but he essentially says, the Bible knows nothing of Lone Ranger Christians. The Bible only knows of Christians who belong to a community, to a body. We might conclude this lecture by saying, the Bible knows nothing of Christians who think of selfhood in the way that Rousseau did. The Bible only knows of Christians who realize that their identity does not lie in moving inward to establish who the authentic person is. It relies on them looking outward to the church around them and to God himself in order to establish who they are. Thanks for listening so patiently.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you for, I was going to say thank you for coming, but you're here, you're amongst us, and we've enjoyed listening to you.
Not bodily, of course. I'm only there sort of in spirit, so my body is a little irrelevant.
I don't really know how to process it, but it's kind of, you're here, but you're not. And well, thank you so much. I have given opportunity for questions, and I believe there are questions, and I'm going to hand over now to John Angus to the screen. Okay. Yeah, just okay.
Yeah, first question on the screen here. How much do you think do I need to read the questions, or can everybody see them?
Okay.
Shall I read them?
Yeah.
Okay. How much do you think the Puritan focus on inward spirituality and personal conversion and dislike of outward complex ritual is connected to this inward turn in society? That is an excellent question. And I think there are clear connections. Because I was running short of time, one of the things I got in my lecture that I was thinking of just alluding to was, of course, while Rousseau is writing his stuff, in America, you have Jonathan Edwards writing The Religious Affections. You have the Methodists gaining steam with their emphasis on the inner life. And I would respond to this question and say, I think they are connected. Where I would now want to add qualifications is I don't think Rousseau's entirely wrong. I do think the inner life is important. The Psalms give testimony to that. Augustine's Confessions give testimony to that. One of the great things about the rise of what is called expressive individualism, which is sort of what we're seeing emerging in Rousseau, one of the things it's often presented expressive individualism as an unremittingly bad thing, particularly in Christian circles. I would say it's a thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. Bad side of it can lead to these notions of authenticity that I've articulated. Good side is I think it allows us to do justice to the existential urgency of the gospel and of personal decision in a way that certainly wasn't the case in the Middle Ages and isn't really a strong suit in the Reformation either. So I'd want to say, yeah, this turn inward, we need to correlate it with the Puritans as well. And it depends what you do with it. I mean, one of the problems you face in the 17th, 18th centuries is a lot of the external sources of authority and selfhood have collapsed. Society is becoming mercantile. Cities are rising. Old urban communities that gave you a sense of place and a sense of identity are crumbling. Read Thomas Hardy's novels for a great sort of literary expression of that from a slightly later age. The church is now a highly conflicted area. You've got Catholics, Protestants, and you've got Lutherans, Reformed, Anglican. External authority is becoming highly contested. That leads to this inner move. So I would say, yes, it's all part of the same broad cultural phenomenon. Though I'd want to say it then depends what you do with it. And the problem with Rousseau is I think he anchors it in an anthropology that's just unrealistic. Whereas for the best of the Puritans, the inward move is always designed to terminate in an outward move to God and not simply in a glorification or an obsession with the inner. Some Puritans, I think, do err that way, but the best of the Puritans do not. So that's how I would answer that question. That's a very good question, actually. Very, very insightful question. Again, what was Rousseau's influence upon Reformed Christians during the 18th century? Do you see today an influence of Rousseau in some Reformed circles in theology and worldview? Good question, hard to answer. Rousseau himself, he converted to various strands of Christianity over his time, depending on where he was living. So he's born a Calvinist in Geneva. He converts back to Calvinism later on. One would be hard pressed to say that he was a full-throated Calvinist in any shape or form. I think the answer, does he have an influence on the 18th century, to some extent ties back to my answer to the first, in that Rousseau is not the only source of this. He just happens to be a particularly influential exemplar of it. I think it's becoming the air that's breathed in the 18th century. So there's certainly parallels and affinities Though, as far as I understand, Jonathan Edwards, for example, he's not being influenced by Rousseau. Locke, if anything, is perhaps more of a significant philosophical influence for him. Do I see his influence today, or the influence of this kind of stuff, in some reform circles in theology and worldview? Absolutely, because I think Rousseau's thinking, expressive individualism, has become the very air that we all breathe, and it's impossible to separate ourselves from it. I'm not a polemic against contemporary worship person. I'm a polemic against bad hymns and bad worship songs whenever and wherever they've been written kind of person. The 18th century produced a fair bit of garbage that has thankfully disappeared. But if you look at some modern worship songs, they certainly seem to focus very much on a kind of Rousseau view of the self. And as that develops into a therapeutic notion of the self, Lauren Daigle, you may not have heard of her, but she won the Gospel Music Award in 2019 in the USA for the song You Say. I didn't even know it was a gospel song. I thought, well, Katrina and I were listening to it on the radio one day, and we thought it was an Adele song. I had no idea that this was a gospel song. And I'm sure she's a lovely person, a lovely Christian. It's not a personal criticism of her at all. But the song is all about how, once you've identified that the you in it is God, which is not entirely clear from the song, but once you've made that connection, it becomes very clear that God's purpose is to make me feel good about myself when my friends have been nasty to me and my boyfriend's left me, kind of thing. And I would say that's very therapeutic, and that stands in line with Rousseau. So the emphasis on the inner life, I think it's alive and well, even in reform circles. And it's something that we all have to be aware of. One odd thing that I've discovered over the years I've thought about this is, I'm a big fan of religious freedom. I really do think religious freedom is important, and I think it's one of the most seriously challenged things in the West at the moment. And it's why I've decided really just to focus pretty much the rest of my thinking and writing and the rest of my life, to the extent I can, on the issue of religious freedom, because it's that important. But when you think about religious freedom, what does it do? It means there's a wide variety of religions and even churches to choose from. And that's a good thing. I don't want to live in China where, I get arrested for going to church. But think about it. It makes religious freedom is a good thing, but it also makes religion a competitive marketplace. And it makes churches competitors for customers. And it makes the customer king. And it means that, well, we can choose our church based on whether it makes me feel good or scratches me where I feel the itch. And we could say, well, we're doctrinal reform people. That doesn't affect us. Well, I want to say to you, I'm a bookish kind of guy. I like reading books and I like ideas. So guess what? I go to churches where ideas are primary. And I like to think of that as normative Christianity. But deep down inside, I also know, Trueman, you'd just be personally uncomfortable in a charismatic church because it wouldn't meet your need. It wouldn't tickle you as you like to be tickled. And I think religious freedom, in some ways, it's a great example of something that's a good, but it brings problems in its wake that actually strengthen this Rousseau/therapeutic dimension. That we are all, including, the most hardcore Sabbatarians, that we're all vulnerable to. We'll all tend towards those churches that kind of resemble what we like to think of ourselves as being.
I'm conscious that you may be pushed for time, Carl, so I'm depending on you to call it.
Yeah, I've probably at about 5 to...
Right.
Whatever the hour is your time, be 5 to 11 my time, I will need to say goodbye and break. I've got to go, believe it or not, I've got to go and lecture on Gregory of Nazianzus to my undergraduate class at 10:30. This is about the biggest gear change I've ever done, I think. So, yeah. Oh, good question. When and what was the tipping point when the Genevan Reformed Orthodoxy of Francois Turretin became the rational theology which dominated by the time of Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Again, it's hard to point to tipping points. Most people actually point to the family. Turretini is a good example that the shift takes place between Francis and his son, Jean-Alphonse, in the latter part of the 17th century. That is fairly typical for the, I won't say the collapse of orthodoxy, but the crumbling and the marginalization of orthodoxy. It's really a late 17th century thing. By that point, Cartesianism, various strands of Enlightenment thinking are starting to penetrate the universities. And also, the economic structure of Europe is making it hard to indulge in the old theological wars that existed. So probably the late 17th, early 18th century, certainly by the time Jean-Jacques Rousseau is operating, you have to be a Calvinist in Geneva to get on, but Calvinism itself is becoming a little bit like subscribing to the 39 Articles in order to be at Oxford or Cambridge in the 18th century would have been. It's becoming a sort of social ritual with that much content. So I would say late 17th century. Wow, that's a really good question. And that's today there seems to be a herd panic response to ethical issues. Why do you think such a self-orientated society is so prone to a collective herd panic mindset? A whole variety of things kick in here. One thing that I didn't deal with today, and I don't really touch on even in the larger book, the role of technology, I think, is significant. That we are seeing today the ability to shape mindsets and to drum up crowds with greater ease and less cost than ever in the history of humanity. It fascinates me that last year people in Britain seem to be more concerned about the Minneapolis police force than they were about the crackdown in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony, for pity's sake, up until 1997. And yet the protests in Britain were by and large about Black Lives Matter. That's not to criticize those protests. I have my own opinions on them. I won't express them just here. It's not to criticize those protests so much as say, isn't it interesting that British people felt more ownership or more connection to events in Minneapolis than to events in one of their most recently ceded colonies? It's a fascinating phenomenon. So I think the herd aspect of that is interesting. I think the great broadening of victimhood is fascinating. One of the things I didn't say today, but which again arises kind of in a genealogy coming from Rousseau, is once you define the self psychologically, sooner or later you're going to define harm psychologically as well. And we are in a very psychologized society. And so the idea, once upon a time, Thomas Jefferson was able to, in his writings on freedom of religion, was able to say, what does it matter if my neighbor believes in one God, 20 gods, or no God at all? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Now, Jefferson there is making, he's operating in a world where harm is physical, somebody's got to break his leg, or financial, somebody's going to do me out of money at some way. It's a very material kind of view of victimhood he has, as it was in classical Marxism. You look at the 19th century, Marx is concerned about social conditions. That's where victimhood lies. My grandfather would have been the same. If I'd said to my grandfather, what does oppression look like, Granddad? He'd have said, it looks like not being paid a good day's pay for an honest day's work, or it looks like not being able to find a job. When we talked about oppression today, we tend to talk in psychological terms. And I think what that has done a twofold disservice to us. One, it has completely collapsed the hierarchy of victimhood, where somebody who's had a bad word said about them can now claim to be the victim of violence. Our notion of what violence is has become very cheapened and expanded. And at the same time, it's allowed for an escalation of rhetoric, whereby, gosh, if you believe this or you hold that view, if you express that view, even to your children in the privacy of your own home, then you're committing a violent crime against some victim in society. And I think that plays into it a large part. I think Christians can be vulnerable to this as well in a different way. We can tend to see everything that's happening as catastrophic. And I would want to say to Christian panic often on the ethical front derives from a lack of understanding that we're supposed to think upon the things above that aren't passing away. Yes, we're living in tough times as Christians. Yes, the situation is getting uncomfortable for us. Yes, we should lament that. But, let's not just sit around and let it happen. Let's not panic. Let's remember that the church wins in the end. Maybe not the Free Church of Scotland, maybe not the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. There's no promise that they have to exist to the end of time, but the church wins in the end. So let's not panic on that front. And let's see how constructively we can respond to these things. Let's not panic about the ethical decisions. Let's use our civil rights of voting, writing to MPs, senators, whatever. And let's think and try to persuade the great middle ground that I still think exists somewhere out there, that there are better ways than the so-called woke group are trying to promote today. Given the complications of the present day, do you think there is a danger that some churches and Christians will begin to devalue assembling together on the Lord's Day for corporate worship? Yes, I do. I know it's played out very differently in Britain to America. America has the First Amendment, and the governments, both at federal and in terms of Pennsylvania, at state level, and we have a Democrat governor in Pennsylvania, was very careful to honor the First Amendment in COVID regulations and restrictions. The churches were they were advised not to meet, but they were not instructed not to meet. I do think the way that a lot of, even in America, I can't comment on the British situation, a lot of people so easily made the transition to being online is kind of worrying. I'm not saying that churches that closed down when the government told them to necessarily did a wrong thing, but it should have been a really uncomfortable thing for people. Some people, it seems to be a very easy move, and that worries me. I always feel that in some senses, the Catholics have an advantage over Protestants on this front, in that I know Catholic theology allows for some exceptions, but by and large, you've got to go to Mass to take Mass. You have to be present there. Your body's important. Protestantism, we can listen to a sermon on our iPod. Why would we want to go in person? What do we lose when we don't go in person? Well, I would want to say we lose an awful lot. But unfortunately, what we lose is not something that appears to have gripped the Protestant imagination quite enough. And I hope one of the lessons coming out of COVID will be, wow, it's great to be back together. It's great not to be wearing masks anymore. And this is an important part of Christian formation, meeting together on the Lord's Day to worship the Lord. How did he influence, the question is, how did Rousseau influence contemporary thought? In some ways, you're asking there the classic, is it ideas or is it material conditions that shape how the way people think? And the answer, of course, is to some extent both. Rousseau's ideas gained significant traction in the French Revolution. I mean, that's one way. You actually have a society there that grabs hold of many Rousseau idioms to rebuild itself from the ground up. It also gains more popular cultural traction because his ideas are grabbed hold of by the Romantics. And so you have these influential poets, artists, musicians, particularly in the early 19th century, producing cultural artifacts that shape how people think. And this is where I feel very ambivalent about Rousseau as well, because I'm instinctively a romantic in the kind of art I enjoy. I love Turner's paintings. I love Chopin and Liszt on piano. And I love books like Wuthering Heights that go straight for the dark and the gloomy and the heart and the emotions, that kind of thing. So there's a cultural component to this. I think there's also a broader structural component. I've mentioned it before, that the general tearing away of external authority, pushes us inward, pushes us in on our own resources. Cities shatter traditional family structures. When I visit Lewis, my wife she knows who her third cousins are. I didn't even know such things as third cousins existed. Coming from Birmingham originally in the United Kingdom, I have a vague idea of who my first cousins are. Haven't seen them. Third cousins? No, you're inventing those. They don't even, no, they exist. In Lewis, you never make a rude comment about anybody because somebody in the room is probably the fourth cousin 3 times removed and you've insulted their family. So, but when you move to cities, family structures collapse. They push you in on your inner resources. So there are all kinds of dynamics at play. Then I think one might say after the Second World War, we have the rise of the affluent consumer society. What is consumerism? Consumerism involves the creation of markets predicated on satisfying individual and personal needs and feelings and desires. So a whole heap of things in our culture make Rousseau's ideas much more plausible and people much more eager to receive them. Now, has everybody read Rousseau? No. They've become part of what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls our social imaginary, the intuitions we imbibe with our mother's milk that shape how we think about ourselves in relation to the world. But no single cause, just a whole heap of what might call elective affinities coming together. Yeah, very good question. My book references poets as unacknowledged legislators of Shelley's time. Who are they today, and how can Christians best undermine their influence today through teaching and preaching? This comes from Shelley's famous essay, A Defense of Poetry, where he's responding to his friend Thomas Love Peacock, who said, you don't need poetry. We just need kind of reason. Shelley says no, but because poetry speaks to the sentiments. Poetry speaks to the emotions. The emotions are the most important part about how people think. He actually lists there philosophers, and he says that the only philosopher he rates is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he rates him because Jean-Jacques Rousseau was also a poet. He was an artist. He was a musician. And what Shelley's getting at here, I think, is a deep truth, and that is we're often shaped. We're more shaped by those things that make us feel in certain ways than make us think in certain ways. You know, over the years, a number of students have asked me, can you provide me with a good argument against gay marriage? And I'll say, well, I can provide you with a number of good arguments against gay marriage, but they're useless. And the students will say, well, why are they useless? I say, well, nobody argued for it in the first place. It's a bizarre idea. People felt it. It seemed fair and just to allow gay couples to solemnize their relationship, for that relationship to be acknowledged at law, and for it to carry with it the benefits, the privileges, the delights, etc., that heterosexual couples have. It was an appeal to the emotions. It's an appeal to the emotions. When Obergefell v. Hodges, the big Supreme Court judgment, came out in favor of gay marriage in 2015, I remember seeing the scenes on the steps of the Supreme Court, and the gay couples rejoicing at the Supreme Court's judgment. And I have pretty strong opinions on gay marriage. Even my heartstrings were pulled. I don't want to make people unhappy. Even my heartstrings were pulled. So when we're looking for the unacknowledged legislators today, we've got to say, well, who are the people shaping the intuitions, the emotional intuitions of the society in which we live? Soap operas, sitcoms, TV shows, chat show hosts, commercials. On the darker side, internet pornography. There's a whole heap of what I would call non-rational artifacts that shape how people think about the world around them. And that makes teaching and preaching on this extremely hard because, okay, you can have Covenant eyes on your computer and not watch pornography. Probably going to see commercials. Commercials, what are they saying? They're saying, life's all about you. You have this need, and buying my product will satisfy it. That's what commercials tell you. Sitcoms, soap operas, movies. How do we handle this? Well, first of all, preaching is basic. And remember, preaching isn't just conveying of information, it's supernatural. We trust the preaching of the word of God. We trust the administration of the sacraments. We trust corporate worship to incrementally, via the Spirit, transform the way we think about things. So let's not get too wrapped up in what techniques do we need in preaching. We can trust God, I think, when the whole counsel is preached, to be transforming the people sitting under the word. I do think some active teaching on how culture shapes our hearts and minds is useful. My book was a sort of attempt to at least try to trigger some of that, because as I said at the start, we can't help being noseblind to the atmosphere that we sniff every day. We can't help not noticing the water we swim in. But when it's explained to us, there is a chance, there is a hope that we can become a little more critical, a little more independent of it. So I would say, learning to be a good cultural critic is not a bad thing, not a bad thing for Christians. At whatever level you're able to do that. And teaching people to not watch some stuff and watch other stuff critically and thoughtfully is a very good idea. It matters what you watch. It really does shape who you are and how you think about the world. Christian apologetics has spent huge resources on addressing Darwinism. Should we be paying more attention to Rousseau and the origins of modern psychology? Possibly. I think the interesting thing about Darwinism is it's another good example of how intuitively we tend to operate. I am intellectually and technically incompetent to tell you anything about Darwinism, pro or con. And yet I might have a strong opinion on it. My neighbor, probably the same, but he may well believe it. He believes it intuitively. Human beings look like apes. It's a powerful story that Darwinism tells. It's sort of persuasive. And that's certainly one challenge for the church today. Though I think that the challenge is in some ways not always with the origin so much as it is with the whole notion of human nature just not having any God-given end or telos. But I suspect the reason why most people don't believe in God, humanly speaking, is not because they've read technical treatises on Darwinism and been persuaded by them. It's because their tastes and intuitions informed by society have made God inherently implausible to them. Take the gay marriage example. If you say, well, why is gay marriage wrong? Well, the Bible says so. So God's a killjoy. God doesn't want people to be happy. That's kind of implausible picture of God to present to people who are steeped in a culture where everything's about personal happiness. Everything's about individual happiness and autonomy, providing you're not hurting somebody else. So I do think that Christian apologetics, simply focusing upon what I would call the intellectual aspects of the faith, is ultimately not going to be persuasive. It's the affective aspects of the faith that are also very, very important. Yeah, good question. If Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that society is to blame for the decline of morals, did he try to answer who or what corrupted society in the first place? People living in small communities are immoral too. Absolutely. And I think what corrupts people is their social engagement with each other. We are this sort of moral blank slate, but put us together and we start competing and all of that kind of thing. And Rousseau was certainly not naive enough to think that we can just go back to being isolated individuals. In fact, there's a big debate as about whether Rousseau ever thought the noble savage existed or whether it was a thought experiment that allowed him to highlight what he thought the problem was. I'm strongly inclined to take the latter position on that. I do think it's true that Rousseau and the Romantics who followed him tended to have a rather naive view of rural life. I was born in Birmingham, but I grew up in the Cotswolds. My wife grew up in a village in Lewis. We lived in a tiny Scottish village in the early years of our marriage. We are well aware that small villages and small towns often have festering personal tensions and corruptions, that the anonymity of the big city actually allows to be diffused. So I would want to say Rousseau did answer the question. It's socialization in general that does it. But yes, he has a rather naive view of smaller communities. And I would track that back, of course, to his rather naive view of humanity. Ultimately, the noble savage cannot even exist hypothetically because the individual on the desert island growing up all by themselves is curved inward, tilts towards doing or thinking bad stuff to the extent that they're capable of doing it. So I would say Rousseau is ultimately a hopelessly naive thinker. But just because he's hopelessly naive and wrong, man is born free and everywhere is in chains, what a joke, doesn't mean that the ideas can't grip the imagination. Because, of course, taking a Christian view of this, I would say Rousseau's ideas tell us exactly what we want to hear about ourselves. We're pretty decent guys and gals, and it's other people that we have to blame for the mess we make of our own lives. And I would say that is very appealing to the fallen human mind.
I think we're going to have one more question, Carl.
Okay, sounds good. I can manage that.
That's what.
If Rousseau argued that traditional society corrupts us and we need to escape it to be our authentic selves, did he have a practical understanding of how an ideal society should run? Well, if you look at the social contract, and he also has this idea of the popular will that emerges there, which is not unique to Rousseau, but that's where you'll find the core of his kind of constructive thinking. If you want to know what that looks like, then look at the French Revolution. Yeah, that's not a great look, I have to say. The popular will, ironically, for Rousseau and those who applied in the French Revolution, becomes a way really of denying the individual. What you end up with is this brutal regime where the will of the individual has to be subsumed by the democratic will of the majority. And that ends up in horrible bloodshed in the French Revolution. It's interesting to contrast the French Revolution with the American Revolution, which I always refer to over here as the illegal rebellion among the colonies. Shortly after, I've reminded students that Jonathan Edwards was actually a British theologian, not an American theologian. America didn't exist at that point. If you compare and contrast the two revolutions, what's stunning about the American Revolution is the comparative lack of bloodshed. And part of the reason for that, I think, is John Locke. John Locke's construction of the social contract and social contract theory is much more respectful of the individual than, ironically, Rousseau's is. So yes, read the social contract. That shows you what Rousseau is thinking of in terms of where society should go. Then look at the French Revolution and see the practical results of that. The streets run with blood. Mary Wollstonecraft speaks about getting blood spattered on her dress as she's walking through the streets of Paris at the height of the terror. Awful experience for her. The French Revolution really shows you Rousseau's ideal society in action. And again, we face a kind of irony today that radical individualism is leading to what? Remarkably authoritarian governments in democratic societies. They're starting to police religious thought now. They're starting to restrict religious worship. Isn't it interesting that a Rousseauian form of individualism seems to default to a rather grim form of corporate authoritarianism in the end?
Carl, we've run out of time, and I'm really sorry. I know that there were another couple of questions. I don't think we've got time to look at them just now. My apologies to those who have submitted questions, but we really need to give you a break before you switch gear to Gregory of Nazianzus.
Oh gosh, yes. I'd rather speak about Rousseau. I think he's somewhat easier to grasp.
I think we need to give you a time for a coffee. Carl, I don't know what to say. I really am grateful that you joined us today. I'm really, really grateful. And I know I speak for everyone. I have no idea how many people you've spoken to this afternoon, no idea who's joined us. But I know that this event's been well publicized, and we're grateful. We're really
thanks very much. Thanks very much.
For your presence here. And it's been really stimulating. I've thoroughly enjoyed the afternoon. And we wish you well in your, yeah.
That was a point of personal privilege. Katrina has just arrived home. Can I allow her to peer onto the screen and give you away? Absolutely. Her old pastor. Katrina, Ivor is on the screen. If you want to say hi.
Hey, Ivor.
Does she know she's talking to about 300 other people as well?
That's cruel. That's really cruel.
Great to see you, Katrina.
Couldn't resist that.
No, thank you so much. And I will say this, to coin a phrase, when I say you must visit ETS next time you're in the UK, I'm not speaking as an Englishman, I'm speaking as a Scotsman, an authentic Scotsman. What you see is what you get. And we would love to have you here at some point in the future.
I would love it. Well, if either of us had people, I'd now say, let your people talk to my people. But as we don't, you better talk to me at some point.
Absolutely. So. Let me just close in prayer.
Okay.
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for gathering us even in these strange conditions. And we thank you for what we've reflected on today and how it impacts on the modern world. We thank you for giving us an insight into why modern thought is the way it is. And we pray that as we reflect on that you will show us how to respond to it and live within a world full of people made in your image and who need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And we ask that you will make us wise and give us a greater understanding of the world we live in. We thank you for that opportunity today. Thank you for Carl and Katrina and for the work that they do, and pray your blessing upon them. Take us safely through the rest of this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Tyler. I must dash. See you.